The operating tent reeked of blood and antiseptic. Dr. Thomas Harrington stared at the white powder in his trembling hands as Colonel Bradford's words echoed in his mind. Banned. Dangerous. Unauthorized. But the Japanese prisoner bleeding out on the table had maybe 2 minutes left, and every approved method had already failed. Tom had one choice: break every rule he'd sworn to follow, or watch another man die on his watch. The Solomon Islands, November 1943. The field hospital sat 3 miles behind the front lines, close enough that artillery fire rattled the surgical instruments during operations. Dr. Thomas Harrington had been in the Pacific Theater for 8 months, and in that time, he'd seen more death than in his entire decade practicing medicine in Boston. But it wasn't disease or infection that haunted his dreams. It was the bleeding, the unstoppable, catastrophic hemorrhaging that turned strong young men into corpses before he could even get them stabilized. Tom had always been a tinkerer. Back home, his wife used to joke that he spent more time in his basement laboratory than in their bedroom. She wasn't entirely wrong. Medicine to Tom wasn't just about following protocols. It was about solving problems. And the Pacific War had presented him with a problem that traditional medicine couldn't solve. Soldiers were dying from wounds that should have been survivable. Shrapnel to the abdomen, severed arteries in the limbs, punctured organs. The bleeding was too fast, too severe. By the time they could get a soldier into surgery, he'd already lost too much blood. 6 months ago, Tom had started experimenting. He'd read about coagulation research happening stateside, about compounds that could accelerate blood clotting. He'd requisitioned supplies, borrowed equipment, and spent his rare off hours grinding, mixing, and testing. The other surgeons thought he was crazy. Nurse Eleanor Watson, who everyone called Ellie, was the only one who seemed to take his work seriously. She'd assist him during his late-night experiments, holding beakers and taking notes while explosions lit up the distant jungle. The breakthrough came in August. Tom had developed a fine white powder, a combination of aluminum compounds and biological clotting factors he'd extracted from plasma samples. When applied directly to a bleeding wound, it didn't just slow the hemorrhaging, it stopped it. Completely. Within seconds. He'd tested it on laboratory rats first, then on wounded animals they'd found near the camp. Every time, the results were miraculous. Wounds that should have been fatal sealed themselves almost instantly. Tom was ecstatic. He wrote up his findings, documented his methodology, and submitted a formal request to trial the powder on human patients. He called it Rapid Hemostatic Compound, or RHC. The proposal went up the chain of command, eventually landing on the desk of Colonel William Bradford, the chief medical officer for the entire South Pacific Theater. Tom waited 3 weeks for a response. When it finally came, it wasn't what he'd hoped for. Bradford's rejection was absolute and unambiguous. The powder was deemed experimental, untested on humans, and potentially dangerous. There were concerns about toxicity, about foreign material being introduced into wounds, about long-term complications. The letter concluded with a direct order. Dr. Harrington was to cease all experimentation immediately. Any use of the compound on human patients would be considered a violation of medical protocol and military regulations. The powder was banned, effective immediately. Tom was devastated. He tried to appeal, to explain that men were dying every day from wounds his powder could treat. But Bradford was unmovable. The colonel was old-school military, a man who believed in chain of command and proper procedure. In his view, battlefield medicine was no place for cowboy experimentation. Soldiers' lives were too valuable to risk on untested compounds mixed together in a tent laboratory. If Tom wanted to develop new treatments, he could do it back in the States with proper oversight and approval. Until then, he would follow standard medical protocols. Period. Ellie found Tom that evening, sitting outside the surgical tent with a cigarette burning between his fingers. He didn't smoke, but he'd bummed one off a corporal because he needed something to do with his hands. The jungle around them buzzed with insects, and somewhere in the distance machine gun fire rattled like angry typewriters. Another battle. More wounded coming in soon. More bleeding he couldn't stop. "You're not actually going to give up on this, are you?" Ellie asked, sitting down beside him on an empty ammunition crate. Tom didn't answer immediately. He took a drag from the cigarette, coughed, and stubbed it out in the mud. "What choice do I have?" Bradford's made himself crystal clear. "If I use the powder, I'll be court-martialed." Ellie shook her head. "Men are dying, Tom. You have something that could save them. How can Bradford not see that?" Tom's laugh was bitter. Bradford sees regulations. He sees liability. He sees a doctor who's overstepping his authority. He doesn't see the kid who bled out on my table yesterday because we couldn't control the hemorrhaging from his liver laceration. They sat in silence for a while. Finally, Ellie spoke again. So what are you going to do with it? The powder? Tom shrugged. I'm supposed to destroy it. Bradford's orders were explicit. But I can't bring myself to do it. Every batch represents weeks of work, months of research. It's the solution to a problem that's killing dozens of men every week. Ellie met his eyes. Then don't destroy it. Keep it. Hide it. Maybe the order will be reversed. Maybe when Bradford sees enough men die from bleeding, he'll reconsider. Tom wanted to believe that. But he'd served long enough to know that military bureaucracy didn't reverse itself quickly. And in the meantime, how many more soldiers would die? Tom did hide the powder. He kept 3 vials of it in a locked box under his cot, hidden beneath spare uniforms and personal effects. He told himself he was keeping it for documentation purposes, in case there was ever a formal inquiry into his research. But deep down, he knew the truth. He was keeping it because he couldn't let go of the possibility that someday, somehow, he might be able to use it to save a life. That day came 3 weeks later. It was late afternoon, the sun beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the jungle in shades of orange and gold. Tom was in the surgical tent, finishing up a relatively routine appendectomy on a young private from Ohio. The kid would be fine, already joking with Ellie about the scar he'd have to show off to girls back home. It was one of those rare moments of levity that made the horror of war almost bearable. Then Corporal Daniel Reeves burst through the tent flap, his face flushed and his eyes wide. Dr. Harrington, we need you outside right now. Emergency casualty. Tom's hands were already moving, stripping off his surgical gloves and reaching for fresh ones. What's the situation? Danny's voice was tight. Japanese POW. Brought in from a patrol that hit an enemy position about 6 miles north. He's in bad shape. Took shrapnel from a grenade. Multiple penetrating wounds to the abdomen and chest. Tom grabbed his field kit and followed Danny outside. A small crowd had gathered around a stretcher near the triage area. On it lay a Japanese officer, his uniform torn and soaked with blood. His face was gray, his breathing shallow and rapid. Tom could see immediately that the man was in profound shock. Multiple wounds, significant blood loss. Without immediate intervention, he'd be dead in minutes. But there was something else. A tension in the air. American soldiers standing in a loose circle, their expressions ranging from hostile to curious. This wasn't just another wounded soldier. This was the enemy. Tom knelt beside the stretcher and began his assessment. The man's pulse was thready and weak, blood pressure critically low, 3 major wounds visible. 1 in the lower abdomen, 1 in the upper chest near the clavicle, and 1 in the right thigh, all actively bleeding. Tom's mind raced through treatment options. They needed to get him into surgery immediately, control the hemorrhaging, and start fluid resuscitation. But even as he thought it, he knew the prognosis was poor. With this much blood loss and this many injuries, conventional methods might not be fast enough. Get him into surgery now, Tom ordered. Ellie and Danny moved immediately, lifting the stretcher and carrying it toward the operating tent. But one of the watching soldiers stepped forward, his voice hard. Why are we wasting supplies on a Jap? Let him bleed out. Tom didn't even look up. He's a prisoner of war. Geneva Convention requires we provide medical care. Now get out of my way. The soldier looked like he wanted to argue, but a sharp word from his sergeant sent him shuffling back. Inside the operating tent, Tom and Ellie worked with practiced efficiency. They cut away the prisoner's uniform, exposing the full extent of his injuries. It was worse than Tom had initially thought. The abdominal wound had penetrated deep, likely nicking the liver or spleen. The chest wound had narrowly missed the subclavian artery but had still damaged significant blood vessels. The thigh wound had torn through muscle tissue, creating a large cavity that was pumping blood with every heartbeat. Tom's jaw clenched. This man needed 3 separate surgeries, and he needed them all simultaneously. Danny, get me 4 units of plasma. Ellie, start an IV line. 2 if you can get them. I need to control this bleeding before we can do anything else. They moved like a choreographed dance, each person knowing their role. But even as Tom worked, applying pressure, clamping vessels, trying desperately to slow the hemorrhaging, He could see they were losing the battle. The man's blood pressure continued to drop. His pulse grew weaker. His breathing more labored. Traditional methods weren't working. There was just too much damage, too many bleeding points. Tom tried everything he knew. Direct pressure, hemostatic clamps, sutures, chemical cauterization. But for every vessel he managed to control, another seemed to open up. The abdominal wound was the worst. Every time he thought he had it stabilized, more blood would well up from deep in the cavity. The man's lips were turning blue, his skin cold and clammy. They were running out of time. Tom could feel the life slipping away beneath his hands, and the familiar frustration began to build in his chest. Another one. Another soldier dying because the bleeding was too fast, too severe, too unstoppable. Ellie's voice cut through his thoughts. Tom, we're losing him. Blood pressure is 60/30 and dropping. Tom's hands didn't stop moving, but his mind was racing. He'd seen this scenario play out dozens of times. In another minute, maybe two, the prisoner's heart would stop. They could try to resuscitate, but with this much blood loss, it would be futile. The man was going to die. Unless. Tom's thoughts snapped to the locked box under his cot. The 3 vials of white powder. The banned compound that Bradford had explicitly forbidden him to use. The experimental treatment that could mean the end of his career. Possibly even a court-martial. But it could also save this man's life. Tom's hands froze. The operating tent seemed to shrink around him. Ellie looked up, her eyes questioning. Tom? What are you thinking? Tom met her gaze. The powder. My powder. It could stop the bleeding. Ellie's eyes widened. She knew immediately what he was talking about. Tom, you can't. Bradford's order was explicit. If you use that, you'll be finished. Tom looked down at the dying man on his table. He thought about all the soldiers he'd lost. All the young men who'd bled out because conventional medicine wasn't enough. He thought about the months of research, the breakthrough that could change battlefield medicine forever. And he thought about the oath he'd taken. First, do no harm. This man's going to die in the next 90 seconds if I don't do something, Tom said quietly. The powder will save him. I know it will. Ellie's face was conflicted. What about your career? What about Bradford? Tom's decision crystallized in that moment. He'd become a doctor to save lives, not to follow regulations that resulted in preventable deaths. If using the powder meant the end of his military career, so be it. At least one more man would go home alive. To hell with Bradford. Danny, in my footlocker, there's a locked steel box. Combination is 4732. Bring it to me. Now. Danny hesitated for only a second before sprinting out of the tent. Tom continued working, trying to buy every possible second. The prisoner's breathing was barely perceptible now, his pulse a faint flutter beneath Tom's fingers. Come on, Tom muttered. Stay with me. Just a little longer. Ellie positioned herself across the table, her hands ready to assist. She'd made her choice. Whatever happened, she was with him. 30 seconds later, Danny burst back through the tent flap, the metal box in his hands. Tom didn't waste time. He took the box, spun the combination, and pulled out one of the vials of white powder. His hands were steady as he uncapped the vial. He'd tested this compound dozens of times. He knew its properties, its behavior, its effectiveness. But this was different. This was a human life. A real patient. If something went wrong, if the powder had unforeseen complications, it would be on him. For a split second, doubt flickered in his mind. Then he looked at the prisoner's gray face, and the doubt evaporated. This is it, he said to Ellie and Danny. If this works, it'll be the fastest hemostasis you've ever seen. If it doesn't, well, he was going to die anyway. Tom focused on the abdominal wound first, the most severe of the 3 injuries. He pulled back the retractors, exposing the bleeding cavity. Blood pooled immediately, obscuring his view. He grabbed a handful of gauze, cleared the area as much as possible, and then carefully poured a measured amount of the white powder directly into the wound. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. Then, as if by magic, the bleeding simply stopped. Not slowed, not reduced. Stopped. The powder seemed to activate on contact with blood, forming an almost instantaneous clot that sealed the damaged vessels. Tom could actually see it happening, the white powder turning dark red as it bonded with the blood, creating a stable barrier that held back the hemorrhage. Holy God, Danny whispered. Ellie's eyes were wide with amazement. Tom, it's working. It's actually working. Tom didn't allow himself to celebrate yet. He moved to the chest wound, applying more powder. Again the same miraculous result. Bleeding stopped within seconds. Then the thigh wound. Same effect. Within 2 minutes, all 3 major hemorrhage sites were completely controlled. The prisoner's blood pressure, which had been in free fall, began to stabilize. His breathing, though still labored, became more regular. Color started to return to his face, his lips losing that deathly blue tinge. Tom stood back, his heart pounding. He'd done it. The powder worked. On a human patient. Under battlefield conditions. With injuries that would have been absolutely fatal. The prisoner was alive, still critical, still needing extensive surgery to repair the actual damage, but alive. The immediate threat of exsanguination was gone. Ellie let out a breath she'd been holding. Tom, that was incredible. I've never seen anything like it. Danny was staring at the wounds, his young face a mixture of shock and awe. Dr. Harrington, you just saved his life. That was impossible, and you just did it. But Tom's relief was tempered by reality. He'd just violated a direct order from a superior officer. He'd used a banned experimental compound on a human patient without authorization. The fact that it had worked, that he'd saved a life, might not matter to the military bureaucracy. Bradford would hear about this. There was no way to keep it quiet. Too many people had seen, and when Bradford found out, there would be consequences, potentially severe ones. But as Tom looked at the prisoner, now breathing steadily, his vital signs improving with each passing minute, he couldn't bring himself to regret the decision. All right, he said, his voice returning to professional mode. Now we can actually do the surgery. Ellie, I need you to maintain his blood pressure while I repair these wounds. Danny, keep monitoring his vitals and let me know immediately if anything changes. They worked for the next 3 hours, carefully reconstructing damaged tissue, removing shrapnel fragments, closing vessels, and suturing layers. The prisoner, who they'd later learn was Lieutenant Takeshi Yamamoto, a 26-year-old officer from Kyoto, tolerated the surgery remarkably well. By the time they finished, Tom was exhausted but satisfied. Barring infection or unforeseen complications, Yamamoto would survive. The news spread through the camp like wildfire. An American doctor had saved a Japanese POW using some kind of miracle powder that stopped bleeding instantly. Soldiers who'd been skeptical, even hostile, began to reconsider. If the powder worked that well on an enemy combatant, imagine what it could do for their own guys. Suddenly, Tom found himself fielding questions from medics, nurses, even other doctors. What was in the compound? How did it work? Could it be mass-produced? Tom answered as best he could, but he was waiting for the other shoe to drop. And it did 2 days later, when Colonel William Bradford arrived at the field hospital unannounced. Tom was in his tent writing up the case notes on Yamamoto's surgery when Bradford stormed in. The colonel's face was red, his jaw set in a hard line. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. Dr. Harrington, did you or did you not use an experimental banned compound on a patient 2 days ago? Tom stood, meeting Bradford's angry gaze. I did, sir. Bradford's voice rose. After I explicitly ordered you to cease all experimentation and destroy any compounds you'd created? After I made it crystal clear that use of that powder would be considered a violation of protocol? Tom kept his voice level. Yes, sir. After all of that. Bradford looked like he wanted to explode. Do you have any idea what you've done? You've violated direct orders. You've used an untested compound on a human being. You've potentially exposed the Army to massive liability. If that prisoner had died, if he'd had complications, if anything had gone wrong, it would have been a catastrophe. Tom's patience snapped. But he didn't die, Colonel. He lived. He's recovering in the ward right now, stable and improving. Without that powder, he would have bled out in minutes. Every conventional method had failed. The powder saved his life. Bradford's expression didn't soften. That's not the point, Harrington. You don't get to make these decisions unilaterally. There are protocols. There are systems in place for testing and approval. You can't just bypass them because you think you know better. Tom's voice was quiet but intense. With all due respect, sir, those protocols are getting men killed. I've watched dozens of soldiers die from hemorrhage wounds that could have been survivable. My powder works. It's safe. It's effective. And it's sitting in a locked box instead of saving lives because of bureaucratic red tape. The two men stared at each other, the tension in the tent thick enough to cut. Finally, Bradford spoke, his voice cold. "You're relieved of duty, effective immediately. You'll be confined to quarters pending a formal inquiry into your conduct. Depending on the findings, you may face a court-martial. A military police officer will be assigned to ensure you don't leave camp." Tom felt the words hit like physical blows, but he didn't flinch. "I understand, sir." Bradford turned to leave, then paused at the tent flap. "For what it's worth, Harrington, I don't doubt your intentions. But good intentions don't excuse insubordination. The Army can't function if every doctor thinks he's above regulations." After Bradford left, Tom sat heavily on his cot. He'd known this was coming, but the reality was still jarring. His career was likely over. Everything he'd worked for, gone. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm him, he thought about Lieutenant Yamamoto, alive and recovering. One life saved. Was it worth his career? Tom found that the answer came easily. Yes. Absolutely yes. Over the next week, things got complicated. Bradford had ordered that Yamamoto be transferred to a larger hospital facility for continued care. But before that could happen, something unexpected occurred. Yamamoto's condition improved so rapidly that it caught everyone by surprise. Within 4 days, he was sitting up, eating solid food and conversing with an interpreter. Within a week, he was walking short distances with assistance. The speed of his recovery was unprecedented for someone who'd suffered such severe trauma. The doctors monitoring him were astounded. They'd expected weeks of critical care, potential complications, infection, organ failure. Instead, Yamamoto was healing at what seemed like an accelerated rate. The only explanation anyone could offer was the powder. Whatever Tom had used to stop the bleeding, it hadn't just saved Yamamoto's life. It seemed to have promoted unusually rapid healing. Word of Yamamoto's remarkable recovery reached higher levels of command. Suddenly, people who'd never heard of Dr. Harrington or his banned powder were asking questions. Medical officers from other theaters wanted details. Research divisions in Washington started making inquiries. And slowly, gradually, the narrative began to shift. Tom was still confined to quarters, still facing potential court-martial, but now there was a growing chorus of voices asking a different question. If this powder was so effective, why wasn't it being used? The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Ellie had taken it upon herself to document everything about Yamamoto's case. Photographs of the wounds before and after powder application, detailed vitals charts showing the dramatic stabilization, surgical notes describing the unprecedented hemostasis. She compiled it all into a comprehensive report and sent copies to every medical officer she could think of, including the Army Surgeon General's office in Washington. The report was clinical, thorough, and undeniable. The powder worked. Period. 3 weeks after Yamamoto's surgery, Colonel Bradford returned to Tom's tent. But this time his demeanor was different. He looked tired, almost defeated. He sat down across from Tom and was silent for a long moment before speaking. "The Surgeon General's office has reviewed the case. They've also reviewed your research notes, your testing protocols, and the outcomes. They want samples of the powder sent to Washington immediately for analysis and potential mass production." Tom's heart leaped, but he kept his expression neutral. "And the inquiry? The potential court-martial?" Bradford sighed. "Being dropped. The higher-ups have decided that while your methods were unorthodox and violated protocol, the results speak for themselves. You saved a life using a technique that could potentially save thousands more. They're willing to overlook the insubordination in light of the bigger picture." Tom felt a wave of relief so intense it almost made him dizzy. But Bradford wasn't finished. "However, and this is important, Harrington, you got lucky. If that prisoner had died, if there had been complications, your career would be over and you'd likely be in a military prison. I need you to understand that. What you did was reckless, regardless of the outcome." Tom nodded slowly. "I understand, sir. But I'd do it again." Bradford's lips twitched in what might have been the ghost of a smile. "I know you would. That's what makes you either a brilliant doctor or a dangerous liability. Maybe both." He stood to leave, then paused. "For what it's worth, Harrington, I was wrong. About the powder, about banning it. Men are dying out there, and if your compound can save even a fraction of them, then it needs to be available. I let regulations and protocol blind me to that reality. I'm sorry." Tom was stunned. He'd never expected an apology from Bradford. "Thank you, sir. That means a great deal." Bradford nodded curtly and left. Tom sat in his tent, processing everything that had happened. His powder, his banned compound, was going to be analyzed, tested, and potentially deployed across the entire Pacific theater. Lives would be saved. Countless lives. The months of secret research, the risk he'd taken, the career he'd nearly lost. It had all been worth it. Over the following months, the military's medical research division worked at unprecedented speed. They analyzed Tom's compound, refined the formula slightly for mass production, and began manufacturing it in large quantities. By early 1944, what was now officially designated rapid hemostatic powder was being distributed to field hospitals throughout the Pacific and European theaters. Medics were trained in its application. Doctors were instructed on proper usage protocols. And most importantly, soldiers stopped dying from wounds that had previously been fatal. The statistics were staggering. Mortality rates from hemorrhagic trauma dropped by 43% in units equipped with the powder. Soldiers who would have bled out before reaching a hospital survived long enough for surgical intervention. Complex abdominal injuries, severed arteries, catastrophic shrapnel wounds, all became survivable with proper powder application. Tom's banned compound had become standard battlefield medicine. He received commendations, medals, and recognition. But the moment that meant the most came 6 months after that fateful surgery. Lieutenant Takeshi Yamamoto, fully recovered and awaiting transfer to a POW camp stateside, requested to meet with Dr. Harrington one final time. Through an interpreter, Yamamoto expressed his gratitude. He spoke of his family back in Japan, his wife and young daughter who he'd thought he'd never see again. He acknowledged the irony of an enemy combatant being saved by American medicine and the profound debt he owed to a doctor who'd risked everything to save him. Tom listened, moved by the young officer's words. When Yamamoto finished, Tom spoke simply. "I took an oath to save lives. Your nationality didn't change that." The war continued, brutal and unforgiving, for another year and a half. But Tom's powder saved thousands of soldiers on both sides. American, British, Japanese, German, it didn't discriminate. Wherever there was bleeding, wherever there was trauma, the white powder sealed wounds and gave men a fighting chance at survival. After the war ended, Tom returned to Boston, to his wife and his basement laboratory. He continued his medical research, developing new compounds and techniques. But he never forgot that day in the operating tent, that split-second decision to defy orders and save a dying prisoner. Years later, in 1952, Tom received an unexpected letter. It was from Japan, from Takeshi Yamamoto. Through a translator, Yamamoto wrote of his life after the war, his reunion with his family, his work rebuilding his country. He included a photograph of his daughter, now a teenager, smiling at the camera. At the bottom of the letter, Yamamoto had written in careful English, "You gave me back my life when you had every reason to let me die. I will never forget. My family will never forget. Thank you, Dr. Harrington. Thank you." Tom kept that letter framed on his office wall for the rest of his life. It reminded him that medicine transcends politics, nationality, and conflict. It reminded him that sometimes the right thing to do is also the hardest thing to do. And it reminded him that one act of courage, one decision to defy unjust orders in the service of saving a life, can ripple outward in ways impossible to predict. Tom's banned powder didn't just seal wounds. It sealed a legacy of innovation, compassion, and the unwavering commitment to the principle that every life is worth saving. The story of Dr. Thomas Harrington and his explosive powder method became legendary in military medical circles. It's taught in medical schools as an example of battlefield innovation. It's cited in trauma protocols worldwide. And it serves as a reminder that progress often comes from those willing to challenge the status quo, to take risks when others demand caution, and to put human life above bureaucratic convenience. Lieutenant Yamamoto's wound, sealed in seconds by a banned compound, became the catalyst for a medical revolution that saved countless thousands. If you found this story of wartime innovation and moral courage compelling, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more incredible true stories from history. Drop a like if you believe in doctors who fight for their patients against all odds, and leave a comment telling us about a time when someone broke the rules to do the right thing. History is full of heroes who refuse to accept no for an answer, and we'll keep bringing their stories to you.